The moment he claimed her as his, he unknowingly stepped into a game he was never prepared to play. The room was built for power, not comfort, not celebration, but control. Every detail within the space reflected that truth, from the low lighting that concealed more than it revealed, to the carefully placed figures who stood not as guests, but as extensions of influence. Conversations were quiet, deliberate, measured. Nothing here was accidental. This was not a place where people gathered. This was a place where power positioned itself. And at the center of it stood Ronan Blackwood. He did not need to speak to be noticed. His presence moved through the room before he did, shifting attention, redirecting focus, altering the energy without effort. There was no hesitation in him, no wasted movement, no unnecessary expression. Ronan did not react. He decided. That was what separated him from everyone else in the room. And that was why no one challenged him. Because men like him did not rise to power by chance. They built it, controlled it, owned it. And once they did, they never let it go. Elena Varelli stood within that same room, but not within that same world. Not truly. From the outside, she appeared exactly where she was expected to be. Composed, silent, unremarkable in a way that allowed her to exist without drawing attention. Her presence did not disrupt the structure of the room. It blended into it, and that was intentional. Because attention, in a place like this, was dangerous. And Elena had spent her entire life learning how to avoid it. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression neutral, her movements minimal. Nothing about her invited focus. Nothing about her suggested resistance. She existed within the environment as something passive, something controlled, something easy to define. But appearances are rarely accurate. And in her case, they were entirely constructed. The distance between her and Ronan closed slowly, not because he rushed, but because everything around him adjusted to make space. Conversations shifted, movement redirected. The room itself seemed to accommodate his path. Power does not push. It pulls. And everything responded accordingly. Elena did not move. She did not retreat. She did not step forward. She remained exactly where she was, allowing the moment to come to her rather than reacting to it. Because reaction reveals position. And position was something she never revealed too early. Ronan stopped in front of her, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with certainty. His attention settled on her. Not casually, not curiously, but deliberately. The kind of attention that does not question what it sees. It defines it. From his perspective, she was simple, unprotected, unclaimed, unimportant, and that combination made her useful. The power imbalance between them was clear, obvious, undeniable. He stood as control. She stood as something to be controlled. And everyone in the room understood that dynamic without needing it to be explained, because this was how power worked. It identified, it selected, it claimed, and once claimed, it did not release. The intellectual hook settled quietly into the space between them. In a world built on control, ownership is never asked for, it is taken. Ronan reached his conclusion quickly. He always did, because hesitation did not exist within his system. And once he decided something, it became reality. The shift happened in a moment so subtle, it could have been missed. If anyone in the room had been capable of missing anything, he did. His attention solidified. His position adjusted slightly. And just like that, the dynamic changed. Not gradually, not uncertainly, but completely. Elena was no longer just present in the room. She was defined within it, claimed, not through words, not through force, but through authority, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And everyone understood. The space around them reacted instantly, quietly acknowledging the shift, reinforcing it without question, aligning itself with the decision that had just been made. Because no one challenged Ronan Blackwood. Not here, not anywhere. Elena felt the shift, not as pressure, but as recognition. She had been seen, chosen, positioned, and now defined. But she did not react. Not outwardly, not visibly, because reaction would confirm the role he had placed her in, and she had no intention of confirming anything. Instead, she remained still, calm, observant, the same way she had always been. But internally, everything sharpened, because this moment was not random. It was not accidental. It was not even unexpected. It was inevitable. The only difference was that he did not know that. Ronan's control extended outward, but it was also precise. His focus on her was not emotional. It was structural. He was placing her within his system, assigning value, determining function, and in his mind, that process was complete. But what he did not realize was that he had just inserted himself into hers. Elena's awareness expanded, not in panic, not in urgency, but in clarity. She observed everything, the reactions around them, the shift in energy, the way his presence altered the space, the way control manifested without resistance. And within that observation, she saw something important. He believed he understood the situation completely, and that belief was his first mistake, because understanding requires truth, and he did not have it. The contrast between them became sharper in that moment. He operated with certainty. She operated with knowledge, and knowledge is always more dangerous than certainty. Ronan did not question her silence. He interpreted it as acceptance, as compliance, as confirmation, because in his world, silence meant submission, and submission meant control. But Elena's silence was not submission. It was calculation. The difference was everything. She allowed the moment to settle, allowed the illusion to take shape, allowed the perception to solidify, because perception, once formed, becomes difficult to change. And she intended to use that, not immediately, not recklessly, but when it mattered. The shift in her position within the room became permanent, not temporary, not flexible, but defined. She now belonged within his system, or at least that was what everyone believed. And belief can be manipulated. The environment stabilized around the new dynamic. The moment passed, not because it ended, but because it had been accepted. Conversations resumed. Movement continued. The structure of the room returned to its original rhythm. But nothing was the same, because now there was a new variable, one that no one fully understood, not even the man who had created it. Elena remained composed, unchanged, unmoved, but internally, the game had already begun, not because she wanted it to, but because he had started it, without realizing it, without understanding it, without preparing for it. And that was what made it dangerous, because control, when built on incomplete information, is fragile, and fragile control breaks. The realization settled into her with quiet certainty, not emotional, not reactive, but absolute. He believed he had claimed her, but in reality, he had exposed himself, and exposure is weakness. As the moment faded into the structure of the room, one final truth remained, sharp, controlled, and impossible to ignore. As he claims her, she doesn't resist, but inside, she realizes he has just made a dangerous mistake. Long before he thought he owned her, she had already mastered the art of hiding who she truly was. The moment Ronan Blackwood claimed her did not define Elena Varelli. It revealed how well she had hidden, because nothing about her presence in that room had been accidental. Not her silence, not her positioning, not even the way she allowed herself to be seen. Everything about Elena Varelli had been constructed long before Ronan ever noticed her, and that construction was her greatest weapon. She had not been born into simplicity. She had been shaped by complexity. Her past was not something visible, not something that could be traced easily, not something that revealed itself through obvious connections. It existed beneath layers, carefully built, deliberately concealed, impossible to understand without looking far deeper than anyone ever did. And no one ever did, because she made sure of it. There had been a time when she existed differently, not weaker, but unprotected, before she learned what the world truly was, before she understood how power operated, before she realized that survival did not depend on strength alone, but on perception. That realization had come early, too early, through loss, through exposure, through moments that forced her to understand something most people never fully grasp. Power does not protect. It consumes, and those who survive within it learn to disappear. The intellectual hook settled into her with quiet precision. The safest place to exist is where no one realizes you are dangerous. That had become her truth, and she had mastered it. Elena did not build her identity to reflect who she was. She built it to conceal it. Every detail was intentional. Her posture, controlled but unassuming. Her presence, visible but forgettable. Her behavior, consistent enough to avoid suspicion, but never strong enough to draw attention. She became something else entirely. Not invisible, but overlooked. And being overlooked was the most powerful position of all, because people only defend against what they see. And no one saw her. Her life had been divided into two realities, the one the world believed, and the one that actually existed. To everyone else, she was simple, unremarkable, easily understood, a presence without influence, a person without power, someone who existed within the system, but did not affect it. That was the illusion. The reality was something else, something far more structured, far more deliberate, far more dangerous, because beneath the surface she presented was control, not the kind Ronan wielded, not visible, not dominant, but precise, internal, strategic. Her thoughts were never reactive. Her actions were never impulsive. Every decision passed through layers of evaluation before it was ever executed, because she had learned something essential. Emotion creates exposure, and exposure leads to destruction. So she removed it, not completely, but enough to remain controlled, enough to remain focused, enough to remain hidden. Her reason for hiding had never been simple. It was not just survival. Though survival had been the beginning, it had evolved into something else, something with direction, something with purpose, something that required patience. And patience was something she possessed completely, because she understood time in a way most people didn't. Time was not something to move through. It was something to use, and she had used it well. Every moment of silence, every moment of observation, every moment where she allowed herself to be underestimated had been part of something larger, not random, not passive, but intentional, because waiting is not weakness, it is preparation. The emotional weight of that life did not appear on her face. It never did, but it existed, deep, controlled, contained. Isolation had been part of it, not forced, but necessary, because connection creates risk, and risk could not be allowed. She had learned to exist without needing validation, without needing recognition, without needing anything that tied her too closely to the world around her, because attachment compromises control, and control was everything. That was who she was, not the woman Ronan had claimed, not the presence the room had accepted, but something else entirely, something he did not see, something he could not define, something that existed beyond the role he had placed her in, and that was what made her dangerous. The memory of the moment he claimed her did not unsettle her. It clarified her position, because it confirmed something she had always known. People like Ronan Blackwood do not look deeper. They do not need to. Their power allows them to define what they see without questioning it, and that is their weakness, because definition without understanding is assumption, and assumption is exploitable. Elena did not resist his claim, not because she accepted it, but because she understood it. And understanding something gives you control over it. She allowed the role to exist, allowed the perception to form, allowed him to believe that he had positioned her within his world, because in reality, she had already positioned herself within his. Long before that moment, long before that room, long before he ever noticed her, the realization settled into her with quiet certainty, not as a question, but as truth. This had never been chance, not her presence there, not his attention, not even the moment he claimed her, because nothing in her life operated on chance anymore. Everything had direction, everything had purpose, everything was aligned, and he was part of that alignment. The thought did not create hesitation. It created clarity. Because if he was part of the plan, then his control was not something to fear. It was something to study, and eventually, something to use. Her awareness sharpened further, not outwardly, but internally, because now the game had structure, not his, hers, and within that structure, she held the advantage, even if he didn't know it yet, especially because he didn't know it yet. As the understanding settled completely into place, one final realization followed. Quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. Looking back, it becomes clear meeting him was never an accident. To the world, he controlled everything, but he had no control over the one person standing closest to him. After the moment he claimed her, Elena Varelli did not resist. She adapted. That was what she had always done. But this time, adaptation did not mean survival alone. It meant entry, because Ronan Blackwood's world was not something people simply stepped into. It was something that absorbed them, reshaped them, defined them, and once inside, very few ever left unchanged. But Elena had not entered his world unprepared. She had entered it with intention. Ronan's empire did not rely on chaos. It relied on structure. Everything within it followed a system. Power layered over influence, influence reinforced through fear, and fear maintained through consistency. Nothing in his world was unpredictable. That was the illusion. The reality was control. Absolute. Every person within his reach had a role, a purpose, a defined position within the system. And once placed, they remained exactly where they were meant to be, because movement without permission did not exist. Ronan did not allow it. That was how he maintained power, not through aggression, but through precision. He did not need to remind people who he was. They already knew, and more importantly, they understood what he could do. That understanding was enough, because fear, when properly placed, does not need reinforcement. Elena moved through his world the way she moved through everything. Quietly, deliberately, without disruption. She did not try to challenge the system. She studied it, because systems, no matter how strong, always have patterns, and patterns can be learned. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with clarity. The strongest systems are not broken by force. They are understood from within. That was what she was doing, not reacting, not resisting, understanding. Ronan's mindset was not difficult to identify. He did not see people as individuals. He saw them as assets, functional, replaceable, valuable only as long as they served a purpose. And once that purpose ended, so did their relevance. That was how he maintained control. Emotion did not exist within his system. Only value, only function, only outcome. And Elena had already been assigned one. Not openly, not clearly, but she could feel it. The way his attention settled on her, not constantly, but intentionally. The way her presence was accounted for within the structure. The way she had been positioned close enough to observe, but not close enough to influence. That was his control. Measured, calculated, precise, but incomplete. Because what he did not understand was that she was not operating within his system alone. She was observing it from outside of it, even while standing inside it. That was the difference. And that difference was everything. Ronan watched her, not obviously, not obsessively, but deliberately. He had already defined her, placed her, categorized her within his understanding. But something about her did not fully align. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. The absence of reaction, the consistency of her composure, the way she did not seek attention, but also did not avoid it. It was not enough to create suspicion, but it was enough to create awareness. Elena felt it, the shift in his observation, but she did not change, because change creates patterns, and patterns create exposure. Instead, she remained exactly as he expected, and that was what made her invisible, while appearing completely visible. The contrast between them sharpened with every passing moment. He believed he controlled the space. She knew she was learning it. He believed he had defined her. She knew she had not yet revealed herself. He believed he understood the system completely. She knew every system has limits, and he had not yet seen his. That was where the imbalance truly existed, not in power, but in awareness, and awareness always determines outcome. Elena's observation deepened, not just of Ronan, but of everything around him, his structure, his people, his patterns, the way decisions moved through a system, the way influence spread, the way control was reinforced without needing to be spoken. She saw it clearly now, not as something overwhelming, but as something structured, something predictable, something that could be mapped. And anything that can be mapped can be navigated. Her movements adjusted slightly, not enough to be noticed, but enough to align with her understanding. She positioned herself within moments of importance, not at the center, but close enough. She listened without appearing to listen, observed without appearing to observe, learned without appearing to learn, because knowledge is most powerful when it is unseen. Ronan's attention returned to her more often now, still controlled, still measured, but more frequent, because something about her remained unresolved. Not a threat, not yet, but not entirely understood. And Ronan Blackwood did not tolerate what he could not fully understand. That was the beginning of the shift, not in his control, but in his focus. And focus is where control begins to change. Elena recognized it immediately, not emotionally, not reactively, but strategically, because attention, when directed, creates opportunity. And opportunity is what she had been waiting for. But she did not act, not yet, because timing is everything. And she was not here to disrupt the system. She was here to understand it completely, before she did anything else. The balance remained intact. From the outside, nothing had changed. Ronan still controlled everything. His empire remained stable. His influence remained absolute. His system remained unchallenged. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, something small, something subtle, something almost invisible. A single variable that did not align. Elena, and variables, when left unexamined, grow. Ronan was beginning to examine, not deeply, not completely, but enough. And that was the beginning of something new, not control, not yet, but curiosity. And curiosity is the first crack in certainty. Elena remained steady, unmoved, unchanged, but aware, because she understood something he didn't. The moment he started observing her, he had already stepped outside of control. And once outside, returning becomes difficult. The system continued. The structure held. The illusion of absolute control remained intact. But beneath it, the foundation had shifted. Not broken, not weakened, but altered. And alteration is where everything begins. As the tension between perception and reality quietly expanded, one final truth emerged, sharp, subtle, and impossible to ignore. Someone close to him begins to notice. She's not reacting like the others. His biggest mistake wasn't claiming her. It was underestimating her. The moment Ronan Blackwood decided Elena belonged within his system, he closed the door without realizing he had opened another, because assumption is the most dangerous weakness power can have. And he had made one, a quiet one, an invisible one, but a critical one. He believed he understood her, and that belief was his first mistake. Elena did not challenge his system. She never intended to, because systems built on control are not broken from the outside. They are studied from within, and then they collapse on their own weight. That was the shift happening inside her. Not sudden, not emotional, but precise. She stopped seeing his world as something to adapt to and started seeing it as something to map. Every movement around her became data. Every decision, his or anyone else's, became a pattern. Every silence carried meaning, because control, no matter how absolute it appears, always leaves traces. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with clarity. No system is truly powerful if it depends on being unseen. And Ronan's system relied on that illusion. Elena began to observe differently, not just actions, but sequences, because isolated moments reveal nothing, but sequences reveal structure. She noticed how decisions flowed, not from chaos, but from hierarchy. Who spoke first, who responded without hesitation, who waited, who avoided, Power wasn't just in Ronan. It was distributed, controlled, layered, and each layer had limits. That was the first pattern. The second came through repetition. Certain outcomes always align the same way. Certain people always move within the same boundaries. Certain situations never escalated beyond a specific point. At first glance, it looked like control, perfect control, but perfection is never natural, and anything unnatural can be broken. Elena followed the pattern deeper, quietly, without shifting her position, because the moment you appear curious, you become visible, and visibility creates risk. So she remained exactly as expected. While thinking far beyond expectation, her awareness sharpened. She began to identify inconsistencies, not obvious ones, not mistakes that anyone could notice, but small deviations, moments where control felt too forced, moments where outcomes aligned too perfectly, moments where the system corrected itself too quickly. And that was where the truth began to form. Because real control does not need constant correction. Only fragile control does. The realization did not surprise her. It confirmed what she had already suspected. Ronan's empire was not flawless. It was maintained. And anything that needs constant maintenance has weaknesses. The shift inside her deepened. Not emotional, not reactive, but strategic. She was no longer just observing. She was analyzing, breaking down what she saw into structure, identifying points of pressure, points of failure, points where the system depended too heavily on consistency, because consistency is predictable, and predictable systems can be controlled. The transformation from control to calculating was complete. She did not feel different. She was different because she was no longer inside a system as a participant. She was inside it as an observer, and observers see everything. Elena began to gather information, not directly, never directly, because direct action creates consequences. Indirect observation creates power. She listened, not to what was said, but to what was repeated. She watched, not movements, but patterns of movement. She memorized, not details, but structures, because details change. Structure does not. The more she observed, the clearer it became. Ronan's control depended on something specific, something hidden, something that connected everything together, not visible, not obvious, but essential. And once she saw it, she could not unsee it. His empire was built on fear, but fear alone does not sustain control. Fear needs reinforcement, consistency, reliability, predictability, and that predictability was his weakness. The realization settled into her with quiet precision, because predictability creates expectation, and expectation can be disrupted. That was where the system could break, not through force, not through confrontation, but through disruption of pattern. The thought did not excite her. It focused her, because knowing a weakness does not mean using it immediately. It means understanding when it matters most. Timing was everything. Elena did not act on what she learned. She held it, stored it, refined it, because incomplete understanding leads to failure, and failure was not an option. Ronan's attention toward her remained controlled, but it had shifted, slightly, enough to suggest awareness, not suspicion, but curiosity. He still believed he understood her, but something about her remained unresolved, and unresolved variables demand attention. Elena allowed it, because attention, when controlled, becomes advantage. She gave him nothing new, nothing different, nothing that would disrupt his assumption, because the longer he believed she was predictable, the stronger her position became. The imbalance between them grew, not visibly, but structurally. He believed he controlled everything. She knew where that control could break, and that difference was everything. The final realization came quietly, not as a moment, but as a conclusion. She had found it. The weakness, not obvious, not immediate, but critical, a point within his system that held everything together. And if that point shifted, everything else would follow. The weight of that knowledge settled into her, not as power, but as responsibility, because now she had a choice to remain within the system or to change it, and change always has consequences. Elena did not decide immediately, because decision requires complete understanding, and she was not finished yet, but she was close. Closer than anyone had ever been, closer than Ronan would ever expect, and that was what made it dangerous. As the realization locked into place, one final truth emerged, sharp, precise, and impossible to ignore. She uncovers something shocking. His empire has a weakness only she can exploit. The moment she stopped playing weak, the game started changing. The discovery of his system's weakness did not make Elena act. It made her precise, because knowing where something can break is not the same as knowing when to break it. And timing, she understood, was everything. Up until this point, she had remained exactly what Ronan believed her to be. Predictable, controlled, easily placed within his structure. That perception had protected her. It had allowed her to move without being seen. But now, it was no longer enough, because remaining invisible meant remaining limited. And she was no longer operating from a place of limitation. She had crossed into something else. Strategy. The transformation did not happen outwardly. It never did. But internally, everything shifted. She stopped holding herself back. Not visibly, but structurally. Her thoughts became sharper, her awareness more focused, her decisions more intentional. Every movement she made, no matter how small, carried purpose now, not just to survive, but to position. The intellectual hook settled into her mind with quiet force. The moment you stop pretending to be weak, you start becoming impossible to control. That was a shift, not rebellion, not resistance, but quiet evolution. Elena did not break a system. She adjusted her place within it. Subtly, carefully, strategically, her behavior changed just enough to create imbalance, but not enough to expose intention. She allowed herself to step slightly outside of the role he had defined for her. Not completely, but enough. Enough to disrupt expectation. Enough to create uncertainty. The difference was almost invisible, but Ronan noticed, not immediately, but inevitably, because systems built on control depend on consistency. And Elena was no longer consistent. At first, it was small, a delayed response, a shift in timing, a decision that did not fully align with his expectations. Individually, each moment meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are impossible to ignore. Ronan's attention sharpened, not aggressively, not suspiciously, but deliberately. He began to observe her more closely, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done something different. And difference creates disruption. Elena felt it, the shift in his awareness. But she did not retreat. She did not correct. She allowed it, because awareness, when controlled, becomes a tool. And she was now using every tool available to her. The silent tension between them began to build, not through confrontation, not through visible conflict, but through perception. He saw the change. She knew he saw it. And neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledgement would define it, and once defined, it could be controlled. So they left it undefined. And that was what made it dangerous. The balance between them shifted, not dramatically, not obviously, but fundamentally. Ronan was no longer operating with complete certainty. Not about her, not entirely. And that small gap in certainty was all it took, because certainty is the foundation of control. And once it cracks, everything else follows. Elena continued her adjustment, carefully, never too much, never too fast, because sudden change creates suspicion. Gradual change creates confusion, and confusion is far more effective. She allowed herself to be seen in ways that contradicted his assumptions, but only slightly, enough to create doubt, but not enough to confirm it, enough to make him question, but not understand. Her presence within his system became something else, not predictable, not fully defined, but not entirely unknown either. She existed between those two states, and that position was powerful, because the human mind seeks clarity, and when clarity is missing, It creates tension. Ronan felt that tension, not as weakness, but as disruption. Something within his system was no longer aligned, and that misalignment was centered around her. He did not confront it. He analyzed it, because that was how he operated. But analysis requires data, and Elena was controlling what data he received. That was her advantage. He was observing her, but she was controlling what he saw. The power shift had begun, not in control, but in perception, and perception determines reality. Elena no longer needed to hide completely. She only needed to guide what was visible, and that guidance allowed her to shape his understanding. Slowly, subtly, without resistance, Ronan's attention became more focused, not obsessive, not emotional, but intentional. He began to notice things he had previously ignored. The way she positioned herself, the way she responded, or didn't, the way her presence felt controlled in a way that did not align with her perceived role. It was not enough to define, but it was enough to question. And question is where control begins to weaken. Elena saw it clearly, the shift in his thinking, the slight delay in his assumptions, the way his certainty no longer moved as quickly as it once did. It was small, but it was real, and it was growing, because uncertainty does not remain contained. It expands. The dynamic between them changed, not in hierarchy, not in structure, but in awareness. He was no longer just observing her. He was trying to understand her, and understanding requires effort. Effort creates focus, and focus creates vulnerability. Because the moment you focus on something you don't understand, you give it power. That was what was happening. Ronan was giving her attention, and attention is influence. Elena did not misuse it. She refined it, controlled it, directed it, because she was no longer reacting to his system. She was shaping how he experienced it. That was a shift. The game had changed, not visibly, but completely. He still held power. He still controlled everything around him, but he no longer controlled how she fit within it. And that difference was everything. The tension reached a new level, not explosive, not visible, but undeniable, because now there was something between them that had not existed before. Uncertainty, not hers, his, and that was the beginning of change. As the shift settled into place, quiet, controlled, but irreversible, one final truth emerged. For the first time, he feels something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The truth didn't just shock him. It threatened everything he thought he controlled. Uncertainty had already entered Ronan Blackwood's world. But uncertainty alone does not break control. Truth does, and truth was something he had never expected to face from her. The shift began quietly, as everything between them always did. There was no dramatic reveal, no confrontation, no moment designed to expose everything at once. Because Elena Varelli did not operate that way. She did not reveal truth. She allowed it to surface. At the exact moment, it could no longer be ignored. That moment had arrived. Ronan had already begun to question her. Not openly, not directly, but internally. The small inconsistencies, the subtle shifts, the quiet imbalance she had introduced into his system, all of it had led him here, to observation, to analysis, to focus. And focus always leads to discovery. The intellectual hook settled into the space between them with sharp precision. The most dangerous truth is the one you uncover yourself, because once discovered, it cannot be denied. Ronan's investigation into her did not begin as suspicion. It began as necessity, a need to restore certainty, a need to correct imbalance, a need to understand what no longer aligned. And Elena was the only variable that did not align. At first, what he found made no sense. Her past, what little of it existed, was incomplete, not erased, not hidden in an obvious way, but fragmented, structured in a way that revealed just enough to appear real, while concealing everything that mattered. That alone was enough to raise concern, because people like her did not exist in his world without history, without connection, without purpose, and she had all three. He just hadn't seen them. Until now, the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. The identity she had presented was not false, but it was not complete. It was a version, a controlled version, designed to be seen, not understood, and that realization shifted everything. Ronan did not react immediately, because reaction, without full understanding, creates weakness, and he did not allow weakness. But internally, the shift was immediate, sharp, irreversible, because the more he uncovered, the more everything connected, not to her present, but to his past. That was where the truth became dangerous, because her existence was not separate from him. It was linked to something he had buried, something he had controlled, something he believed was finished. But it wasn't. Elena Varelli was not just an unknown variable. She was connected to something he had once eliminated, or believed he had, a rival structure, a rival force, a system that had existed in opposition to his own and had been removed completely, or so he thought. The realization hit with precision, not as confusion, but as clarity. She was not random. She was not misplaced. She was not accidental. She was intentional, placed, positioned, and now revealed. The emotional response followed, but it was not simple. It was layered, controlled, but intense. Shock came first, not because he was unprepared for threats, but because he had not identified her as one. That was the difference. That was the failure. And Ronan Blackwood did not tolerate failure. Anger followed, not explosive, not visible, but contained. Because anger, when controlled, becomes focus, and as focus locked onto her completely. Confusion existed too, not in understanding what she was, but in understanding how she had remained hidden for so long, how she had entered his system, how she had positioned herself so precisely without being detected. That was what unsettled him most, because it meant one thing. She had been operating at his level without him realizing it, and that was unacceptable. The tension between them reached its peak, not through confrontation, but through awareness. Everything that had been unspoken was now understood. Everything that had been hidden was now visible, not to the world, but to him. And that was enough. Elena did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She did not change her behavior, because she didn't need to. The truth had already done the work. It had revealed itself, exactly as she intended. Her calm remained intact, unshaken, unmoved, because this was not a moment of exposure for her. It was a moment of positioning. The shift in power was immediate, not in control, but in perception. Ronan no longer saw her as something within his system. He saw her as something outside of it, something that had entered it deliberately, something that had remained hidden, something that now had to be understood and possibly eliminated. But even that thought was no longer simple, because eliminating her would not restore control. It would confirm loss of it. And Ronan Blackwood did not confirm loss. The dynamic between them transformed completely. Not owner and controlled, not observer and subject, but something else. Two forces operating within the same space, with opposing intentions and equal awareness. The emotional tension between them sharpened, not softened, not resolved, because this was no longer about control. It was about conflict, not external, but internal, because part of him recognized what she was, a threat, a calculated, precise, controlled threat. But another part recognized something else, something he had not expected, respect, not given, not chosen, but formed, because she had done something no one else had. She had entered his system and remained unseen until she chose not to be. That was power. And Ronan Blackwood understood power better than anyone. The realization settled into him fully now. Clear, unavoidable, final. She had never been his. Not from the beginning. Not even for a moment. Everything he believed he controlled had been incomplete because she had always existed outside of it. And now she stood within it, fully revealed, fully aware, fully dangerous. As the truth settled between them, Sharp, cold, and irreversible, one final realization emerged. He realizes she was always a threat. The moment the truth came out, control didn't disappear. It changed hands. Once Ronan understood what Elena truly was, the illusion control did not collapse. It restructured, because power, when challenged, does not vanish. It adapts, and both of them understood that. The silence between them was no longer neutral. It carried weight, not confusion, not uncertainty, but recognition. Everything that had once been undefined was now clear. She was not part of a system. She had entered it, calculated, deliberate, purposeful, and now that truth had surfaced, there was no returning to what existed before, because awareness changes everything. The intellectual hook settled into the space between them with sharp precision. The moment two people understand each other completely, control becomes a battle, not a possession. That was where they stood now. Not above, not below, but opposite, equal in awareness, equal in intention, and equal in danger. Elena did not react to the revelation. She did not escalate. She did not attempt to assert dominance. Because control, when real, does not need to prove itself. It operates quietly. And she understood that better than anyone. Her strategy did not change. It evolved. Now that Ronan knew what she was, her position shifted from hidden to exposed. But exposure, in her case, did not create weakness. It created leverage. Because now, everything was visible. And visibility can be controlled just as much as invisibility. She began to move differently. Not more aggressively, but more directly. Her decisions carried weight now, not because she demanded it, but because he recognized it. That was a shift. Before, her actions existed within his assumptions. Now, they existed within his awareness. And awareness forces acknowledgement. Ronan adjusted immediately, because that was who he was. He did not hesitate. He did not allow imbalance to remain unchecked. He recalibrated. His system shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. He removed assumptions, replaced them with analysis, replaced them with structure, replaced them with control, because control was what he did best. He began to observe her differently, not as something within his system, but as something external to it, something that required understanding before action, and that slowed him down. Just enough, because understanding takes time, and time creates opportunity. Elena used that, not recklessly, not immediately, but precisely. She positioned herself within the gaps his adjustment created. Small gaps, brief gaps, but enough, because she no longer needed to navigate his system blindly. She could now move through it with awareness of how he would respond. That was her advantage. He was adapting to her. She had already adapted to him. The dynamic between them shifted completely, not in power, but in perception. He no longer saw her as something to control. He saw her as something to counter. And that changed everything, because control is one-sided. But conflict is not. Their interactions, though still silent, still controlled, still without direct confrontation, carried something new, tension, not the kind created by imbalance, but the kind created by equality, each aware of the other, each measuring, each calculating, each waiting, because neither of them moved without purpose. And now, every move mattered. The emotional layer beneath it all deepened, not simplified, not resolved, but intensified. Hate existed. It had to, because she had disrupted his system, because she had exposed a weakness he had not seen, because she had challenged something he did not allow to be challenged. But alongside that hate was something else, something far more complicated. Attraction, not emotional, not personal, but structural, because power recognizes power. And she had it, not in the way he did, but in a way he could not ignore. And that created tension, because attraction to something dangerous is never safe. Respect for him, too, not given freely, not acknowledged openly, but present, because she had done something no one else had. She had stood inside his world and changed it without breaking it, without forcing it, without exposing herself until it mattered most. That was precision, and Ronan respected precision, even when it worked against him. The balance between them stabilized into something new, not peace, not control, but equilibrium, a state where neither had full dominance, and neither was willing to concede, because conceding was not an option. Elena held her position, not aggressively, not defensively, but with certainty, because she no longer needed to prove anything. The truth had already done that. Ronan continued to adapt, to analyze, to adjust, because losing control was not something he accepted, but regaining it was no longer simple, because this was not a system he could dominate alone. It required engagement, direct, focused, intentional, and engagement creates risk. The space between them remained charged, not explosive, but constant, because every moment carried possibility. Every decision carried consequence. Every movement could shift everything, and neither of them ignored that. The game had changed, not because one of them had won, but because both of them now understood it completely, and understanding removes illusion. What remained was truth, raw, uncontrolled, unavoidable. As a new balance settled into place, sharp, dangerous, and irreversible, one final truth emerged. Even with the truth revealed, he doesn't let her go. He claimed her as his, but she was never meant to belong to anyone. The moment Ronan chose not to let her go did not restore control. It redefined it, because what existed between them was no longer built on assumption or illusion or imbalance. Everything had been exposed. Everything had been understood. And yet, nothing had ended. That was the truth neither of them could ignore. Elena Varelli was no longer hidden. Not from him, not from the system, not even from the position she now held within it. She stood exactly where she had intended to stand, not beneath his control, not outside his reach, but within his world, on her own terms. That was the difference. And that difference changed everything. The intellectual hook settled into the space between them with quiet intensity. The most dangerous kind of control is the one you willingly step into. That was where she was now. Not trapped, not forced, but choosing. And choice creates power. Elena was no longer adapting to a system. She was existing within it, fully aware, fully conscious, fully in control of herself. Every movement she made carried intention. Every decision reflected clarity. Every moment of silence held meaning. She was no longer playing a role. She had become the structure of her own control. Fear no longer existed in the way it once might have, because fear requires uncertainty, and she was no longer uncertain. Not about him, not about herself, not about the world she had chosen to remain in. That clarity was what made her untouchable, not physically, but psychologically, because control, when applied to someone who understands it completely, loses its effect. Ronan saw it, not as a flaw, but as a reality. He no longer tried to define her, no longer tried to reduce her into something that fit within his system, because he understood now she did not fit. She never had, and she never would. That was a shift, the realization that could not be reversed, the understanding that changed everything. Elena was not something to be controlled. She was something to be engaged with, and engagement is not ownership. The dynamic between them settled into something neither of them had anticipated, not controlled, not free, but something deeper, something that existed between structure and chaos, between intention and unpredictability, between power and something far more complicated. They were no longer operating from positions of hierarchy, not entirely. Ronan still held power. He still controlled the system. He still defined the structure. But within that structure, she moved independently, unaffected, uncontained, and that was what made her dangerous, because systems are built to contain variables, and she could not be contained. His attention remained fixed on her, not constantly, not obsessively in appearance, but consistently, inevitably, because she had become something he could not remove, not from his system, but from his focus. And focus, when it cannot be redirected, becomes fixation. The shift in him was subtle, but undeniable. What had once been control had evolved, not into weakness, but into something less defined, something less structured, something more personal. He did not lose control. He redirected it toward her, and that was the beginning of obsession, not emotional in the way others might understand, not driven by impulse, but built on awareness, on recognition, on something he could not fully define, but could not ignore. Elena recognized it immediately, not as vulnerability, but as change. Because when someone like Ronan Blackwood begins to focus on something he cannot control, that focus does not disappear. It deepens, and depth creates attachment. Even when it is not acknowledged, even when it is not wanted, the balance between them held, not stable, not predictable, but sustained, because neither of them broke it. Neither of them forced resolution, because resolution would mean ending something neither of them fully understood, and understanding was still incomplete. That was what made it dangerous. Not the control, not the power, but the lack of finality, the absence of an ending, because without an ending, everything continues. Elena did not seek to leave, but she did not belong. That was the truth. She existed within his world, but she was not defined by it. She stood beside him, but she was not controlled by him. She moved within his system, but she was not part of it. And that position could not be categorized, could not be contained, could not be owned. Ronan understood that now, completely, finally, and that understanding did not push him away from her. It did the opposite. It held him there, because things that cannot be controlled demand attention, demand focus, demand resolution, and resolution was something he could not achieve, not with her, not like this. The world around them remained unchanged. The system continued. The power remained. Everything operated as it always had, but something within it was different, something that did not align, something that could not be corrected, something that existed outside of structure, yet inside it at the same time. That something was her, and she did not leave, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. And that choice was the final shift, because now nothing about this dynamic was forced, nothing was assumed, nothing was misunderstood, everything was known, and still it continued. As the silence between them settled into something deeper, something darker, something unresolved, one final truth remained. In trying to own her, he became the one who couldn't escape,